Welcome to Beat Diabetes. I'm Dennis Pollock, and I want to talk a little bit about an article I saw recently. It's from the New York Times, and no, I don't I don't get the New York Times coming to my door, but I saw it on my phone, and it was about diabetes and diabetics, and that got my attention. And in fact, the headline of the article I didn't much care for, and we'll get into that. The article's title is Older People May Not Need to Watch Blood Sugar So Closely. Well, I am an older people, and I watch my blood sugar pretty closely, although I don't have to test like I used to because I know what foods do and what they don't do, which foods work for me and which ones don't. But anyway, they don't need to test their blood sugar very closely. I thought, well, that is interesting. Wonder what the rationale is behind that. Here's a couple of the statements that are made in this article. These at the very top, subheadings, you might say. Intensive management of diabetes pays fewer dividends as patients age and raises the chances of hypoglycemia. Now, this article is all about the dangers of hypoglycemia, and the idea behind the fact that you don't have to watch your blood sugar very much when you're old or as much is you've got a bigger danger of hypoglycemia and falling down and cracking your head or breaking a bone than you do with blood sugar in the 140s, 150s, whatever. Another statement that's made is that hypoglycemia occurs more often for those of advanced age, and that can create a higher risk of falls and injuries. So older people tend to get hypos more than younger people. Could be a lot of reasons for that. You'd have to really do a lot of studies to kind of parse that out and figure out, is it because they just don't watch themselves very well? What's the reason for that? I'm not sure myself. They define hypoglycemia as having glucose that runs less than 70 milligrams per deciliter. So once you get into the 60s, you're having what we call a hypo. Every time I talk about a hypo on this program, someone will leave a comment and say, "What is a hypo?" Kind of shocks me that anybody that has any interest at all in diabetes would not know what a hypo is, but it stands for hypoglycemia, which means your blood sugar is just dropping too low. Now, who gets blood sugar that drops too low? Well, primarily, and they acknowledged in this article that this is the case, it's people that are taking insulin and high-powered diabetic meds. It's if you're trying to deal with it by diet, that's you're not going to get hypos almost for sure. Now, I did get what I call a natural hypo. I got natural hypos for a while when I was younger because my pancreas was overreacting, but that's another story. Most people are not in that case. But here's a shocking statement. They talk about a particular lady who's concerned about her mother who is diabetic and elderly, and the doctors have advised her to let her A1c rise past 7. She was trying to keep it under 7, this elderly diabetic, and they said, no, don't even try to keep it under 7. Let it go above 7. And they make this statement, which to me was just shocking. They say, don't worry too much about the highs. We want to prevent the lows. Well, that kind of runs contrary to most diabetics. Most diabetics are saying, hey, I don't want blood sugar in the 180s, 200s, 220s, and you test your glucose and it reads 225 and you get concerned, and they're like, don't worry about that. We just don't want you to have a hypo. And to me, it kind of reminds me of whether you're going to get attacked and eaten by a bear or a tiger. Neither one is very good. But they're saying for older people especially, you got to prevent those hypos, even if it means allowing your glucose levels to rise and then rise some more. And they talk about this elderly lady who she used to take pride in the fact she could keep her A1c below 7, keep it in the 6s, and her doctors would praise her and tell her, you're doing good, you're doing good. And she's like, well, what's going on here? Now they're telling me let it rise, my A1c rise into the 7s or beyond. It's like they've changed the rules. And in this article written by Paula Spann, who writes a column about aging for the New York Times, In this article, she says, in fact, they have. That is, they've changed the rules. Well, in one sense, it's not really that much of a change because doctors have been saying for 50 and 60 years. Dr. Bernstein ran into this when he was just getting started in trying to figure out how to beat diabetes, that a lot of doctors would rather you run on the high side and not get hypos than have you try to control your glucose more carefully and face the danger of hypos. So she mentions that the American Geriatrics Society for over 10 years now has called for a hemoglobin of 7.5 to 8 for most older adults. So and 7.5 or 8, that's pretty high, but they're like, that's okay. It's better that and no hypos than have an A1c of 6.0 and frequent hypos. Again, the lion, the tiger or the bear, which one you want to get eaten by? And even go as far as to 9% A1c for those who have not only diabetes, but also other illnesses and serious chronic diseases. So pretty crazy. They call it deintensification. In other words, they're starting to tell people, diabetics, type 2s, mind you, to maybe you don't need to take so much meds. Maybe you shouldn't worry about it if your A1c is 7.5 or even 8. We just don't want you to get any hypos. After all, you could be driving a car and you pass out, or you could fall and crack your skull or break a bone. So by all means, don't get a hypo. Well, let me say hypos are nothing to mess around with. And there is danger to hypos. But hypos, and they mention that in this article, are really only relevant to people that take lots of insulin and diabetic meds. And if you're trying to beat diabetes by diet and you're not taking these, or you're taking a very small measure of them, chances are you won't even know what a hypo is. You'll never get one throughout your life. One exception to this is that if you are just switching from a high-carb standard junk diet to a low-carb diet, if you're taking diabetic meds or insulin, you could indeed get a hypo. So always, always, always test your glucose frequently when you're doing this and stay in close contact with your doctor. Keep him in the loop. When you go from a high-carb diet with meds to a low-carb diet, you're almost always going to need to adjust your meds downward. One of the things they mention in the article is that if you're 80 years old, you're probably not going to live that much longer anyway. And if you try to get tight control and get your glucose levels down, you may need 7, 8, 10 years before you're going to see benefits from that. And first of all, I don't believe that. But anyway, they're like, well, you're not going to live much longer anyway. So just let your blood sugar levels rise and let them float upwards. Just avoid hypos, whatever you do. They make the point in this article, which is true, that there are two kinds of drugs implicated in hypoglycemia from the old. They've got some newer ones out now, but two kinds of diabetic drugs. One, obviously, is insulin. And then secondly, sulfonylureas, kind of hard to say, like glyburide, glipizide, and glimepiride. And sulfonylureas, I kind of like to compare to taking a wet wash rag and just squeezing it until all the water runs out. And that's in essence what they're doing to you. They're squeezing your pancreas, not literally, obviously, but they're more or less coercing or forcing your pancreas to put out more insulin than it normally wants to give. And they can cause a hypo. And they're right, they can. So if you're taking diabetic meds, like sulfonylureas and insulin, then yeah, you are facing the chances of a hypoglycemic episode. Your blood sugar drops too low. You can even pass out. You can even die. You're facing that risk. And this article would make perfect sense if you did not take into account the fact that you can accomplish as much or more with diet than you can with drugs. I'm talking about the type 2 now. Type 1 has to take insulin, but the type 2 in most cases do not, unless you've blown out your pancreas. They don't even mention diet as an issue. They're like, well, you're an old person. What are you going to do about changing your diet? You've been eating the standard American diet, standard junk diet. You've been eating your Twinkies and your cakes and drinking your sodas all this time. We're not going to try to stop you there. So this article would make perfect sense if that's what you're determined to do. But if you start making an effort to beat diabetes with a low-carb diet and some time-restricted eating, this article makes no sense at all. It doesn't even relate to you. When I read this article, I'm sharing it for some of you that you're still weighing which way you want to go. But for me, and let's face it, I represent the old people. I'm an old guy. I'm past 70 and just about to turn 72. For me, reading this article, it's about as relevant as me reading about a problem that people living in the mountain villages of Nepal are having. I'm like, well, I don't live in Nepal. I don't live in a mountain village. It doesn't relate to me. And the idea that you better ease up on your meds so that you don't get hypos doesn't relate to me. I don't get hypos. I don't take sulfonylureas or any other diabetic med. I don't take insulin. If I was a type 1 and I had to take insulin, I would eat a low-carb diet just as Dr. Bernstein has recommended all of his life. I would eat a low-carb diet and I would take the necessary insulin to match that. But it wouldn't have to be nearly so much. And again, you would face very little chance of hypos. So it would make sense if you just said, well, there's no such thing as beating diabetes by diet, but there is, and we see the testimonies of this all the time. They don't say a word about dietary change. They just don't talk about it. They're just assuming old people, well, they haven't yet. They probably never will. Tight control. Let me just say a quick word about tight control. Tight control can be either a great blessing or a terrible danger. If your idea of tight control is, well, my A1c is 8, so I'm going to take more insulin, and I'm going to take sulfonylureas, and I'm going to just do everything I can through drugs to get my get my glucose levels down, that is dangerous. And so tight control, if that's your idea of tight control, you'd be better off doing exactly what they say in this article. Just go ahead and let your blood sugar rise and deal with the complications. So I lose a toe. So they cut off a leg. So my life is shortened by 10 years, 15 years. So I've got kidney disease. So I've got liver failure. At least I don't have hypos. Well, there is a way to avoid hypos and have good, tight control. But again, it is through diet. It is through a low carbohydrate diet. It is through giving up bread and giving up pasta and giving up sweets and sugars and soda and fruit juice. And yes, even fruit like mangoes and oranges and all the sweet fruits. Bananas are a terrible nightmare for diabetics. There's a way to beat it and have almost no chance of hypos. But if you don't do it through diet, then what they're saying is probably right. Just go ahead and live with an A1c of 8. Live with your medical problems and your diabetic complications and let your life be shortened. So be it. At least as you're passing through the end of this life, you can say, well, at least I never had a hypo in the last 10 years. Sure, my A1c was 8 or 9, but no hypos for me, baby. Well, you can guess what I think about that. Okay, there is my rant for the day, but if you'll stop and think about it, it makes perfect sense. The dietary cure for diabetes, to get your numbers down and avoid hypos through a low carbohydrate diet with a little time-restricted eating thrown in, works spectacularly well. In addition to Beat Diabetes, Benedict and I do have another YouTube channel and another type of ministry. I'm referring to our Bible teaching channel, which goes by my name, Dennis Pollock. While you can only see Benedict with me on Beat Diabetes occasionally, you can see us study the Bible together at our dining room table every Thursday. With all that we're doing, producing hundreds of videos and podcasts, sponsoring African missions, helping diabetics reverse their diabetes, giving food to African widows, and sponsoring free medical clinics in Nigeria and Kenya. We need your help. Please consider making regular contributions to Spirit of Grace Ministries.